It doesn't happen the way anyone expects. There's no dramatic exit, no explosive confrontation, no moment where the empath stands up and declares they're done. What actually happens is quieter than that, almost invisible. One morning they wake up and realize the thing they've been gripping with white knuckles for years, the relationship, the hope, the belief that someone would finally change, has already slipped from their fingers. They didn't decide to let go. Something deeper than decision made the choice for them. Jung recognized this moment in his patients, and it unsettled him. He'd watched someone who had been locked in the same painful cycle for years suddenly arrive in his office with a different quality in their eyes. Not harder, not colder, just finished in a way that couldn't be performed or manufactured. He called it the critical threshold of individuation, the point where the psyche determines that holding on has become more dangerous than releasing, and initiates the letting go without the ego's permission. What disturbed Jung wasn't that this happened. It was how the people around the empath responded when it did. Because when an empath finally lets go, the entire system that depended on their grip begins to panic. And the empath themselves enters a phase so psychologically disorienting that most mistake it for breakdown when it's actually the first real step toward becoming whole. Today I'm going to walk you through what Jung discovered about this critical moment, what empaths are actually releasing when they let go, why the psyche forces this release when the conscious mind refuses to, the 3 layers of grief that follow, and what emerges on the other side that makes this moment the most important turning point an empath will ever experience. To understand what's really happening when an empath lets go, you have to see what Jung saw when he looked beneath the surface of their holding on. Because empaths don't hold on the way other people hold on. Their grip isn't just emotional attachment, it's structural. It's woven into the architecture of how they learn to exist in the world. Jung traced this back to the earliest years. The child who grew up in an environment where love was conditional, unstable, or dangerous didn't just learn to be careful. They learned that their survival depended on maintaining connection at any cost. The cost might be their own needs, their own truth, their own boundaries, their own identity. But the cost was always paid because the alternative, disconnection, felt like annihilation to a nervous system that equated attachment with staying alive. So the empath developed a grip, not on any one person or situation, but on a belief system so deep it became invisible. The belief that if they just loved hard enough, understood deeply enough, forgave generously enough, stayed patient long enough, the other person would finally become safe. The relationship would finally become what they needed. The pain would finally be justified by the transformation they were waiting for. This grip isn't weakness. Jung was insistent about that. This is a survival adaptation operating exactly as designed. The child's psyche built this holding pattern because releasing it would have meant accepting something no child's mind can metabolize, that the person they depend on for survival is incapable of providing what they need. That realization would shatter a child. So the psyche builds the grip instead. Hold on, keep trying, make yourself indispensable. And the unbearable truth gets buried beneath effort and hope, and the relentless belief that enough love can fix anything. The problem is that the grip doesn't release when the child grows up. It transfers. It attaches to partners who feel familiar, which means partners who replicate the original wound. It attaches to friendships that drain rather than sustain. It attaches to family dynamics that haven't changed in decades and won't change in the decades ahead. The empath keeps gripping because their psyche is still operating from the child's logic. If I let go, I die. Empaths could intellectually understand this pattern and still be unable to release it. They'd sit in his office describing their own dysfunction with startling clarity. They could see the pattern, name it, explain its origins, trace it through every relationship they'd ever had, and they still couldn't let go. Because the grip wasn't being maintained by the conscious mind. It was being maintained by a part of the psyche that predated language, predated logic, predated everything the adult mind had learned about healthy relationships. You can't think your way out of a survival response. The body doesn't care what the mind understands. So the letting go, when it finally comes, doesn't originate in understanding. It originates somewhere deeper. Jung described it as the self, the totality of the psyche, overriding the ego's desperate need to keep holding on. The self has been watching the empath burn through their vitality, their health, their joy, their sense of reality. And at some point, something in the psyche's deepest architecture makes a calculation the ego would never consent to. This grip is now the primary threat to survival. What once protected the child is now destroying the adult. The organism must release, or it will not survive. This is why the letting go feels involuntary. The empath doesn't choose it the way you choose to leave a room. They experience it the way you experience a fever breaking. Something shifts beneath conscious control. The hands open, the rope drops, and the empath stands there stunned, looking at their empty palms, unsure whether they just lost everything or were finally set free. The first thing that hits is silence. Not peaceful silence, disorienting silence. The empath has spent years, sometimes decades, with their entire nervous system organized around the effort of holding on. Their thoughts, their energy, their emotional bandwidth, their daily decisions, everything filtered through the question of how to maintain the grip, how to keep the relationship alive, how to manage the other person's moods, how to stay connected despite being hurt, how to justify staying despite knowing they should leave. When that organizing principle suddenly vanishes, the empath doesn't feel liberated. They feel formless, like a building whose scaffolding has been removed before the walls are finished. Jung described this phase as ego dissolution, not the romanticized spiritual version, but the raw psychological experience of having your primary identity structure collapse. Because the empath's identity was built around holding on, around being the one who stays, the one who understands, the one who loves unconditionally, the one who never gives up on people. Remove the grip, and the empath is left facing a terrifying question. Who am I if I'm not the one holding everything together? This question doesn't have an easy answer, and the empath has to sit in the not knowing, which is excruciating for someone whose entire life has been organized around hypervigilance and control. They controlled through love, through attunement, through anticipating needs and managing atmospheres, but it was still control. And now that control has been released, and the void it leaves is vast. Jung noticed that people around the empath consistently misread this phase. They see the stillness and assume depression. They see the withdrawal and assume avoidance. They see the emotional flatness and assume the empath has become cold or heartless. What they can't perceive is that the empath is in the middle of the most significant psychological reorganization of their life. Everything that held their identity together has been removed, and the psyche is rebuilding from the foundation up. That process doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like someone sitting very still in a room, staring at a wall, feeling everything and nothing simultaneously. The grief arrives next, but not in the form anyone expects. Jung identified 3 distinct layers of grief that empaths move through after the letting go, and each one is more destabilizing than the last. Understanding these layers is crucial because most empaths get trapped in the first layer and never reach the deeper ones, which is where the real transformation lives. The first layer is grief for the person or relationship they released. This is the grief everyone sees and understands. The empath mourns what they lost. They cry. They remember good moments. They ache for the connection that's gone. This grief is real and painful, but it's also the most manageable layer because it has a clear object. You know what you're mourning. You know why it hurts. The loss is tangible. But beneath that grief lives something far more unsettling. The second layer is grief for the years they spent holding on. This is where the empath begins to confront not just the loss of the relationship, but the cost of maintaining it. The years of energy poured into someone who couldn't receive it. The opportunities missed because they were too consumed by the effort of keeping something alive that was already dead. The version of themselves they might have become if they'd let go 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier, 20. This grief carries rage inside it. Not rage at the other person, though that might surface too, but rage at themselves. How did I not see this sooner? Why did I stay so long? What was I thinking? The empath who spent years being compassionate toward everyone else now turns the full force of their perception inward, and what they see is devastating. They see their own complicity, their own avoidance disguised as patience, their own fear disguised as love, their own need to be needed disguised as generosity. Jung warned that this second layer of grief is where many empaths get stuck, because the self-directed rage can become a new prison, replacing the prison of holding on with the prison of self-punishment. The empath trades one form of suffering for another, now beating themselves up for having suffered the first way. This is not integration. This is the shadow finding a new costume. Moving through this layer requires something empaths are rarely good at: self-compassion that isn't performative. Not the Instagram version of self-care, not the bubble bath and affirmations. Real self-compassion, the kind that looks at every year spent holding on and says, "You did the only thing your nervous system knew how to do. You weren't stupid, you weren't weak. You were a child's survival response operating in an adult body, and you didn't have the internal resources to override it until now." That's not failure. That's the human condition. The third layer of grief is the one Jung found most significant, and it's the one almost nobody talks about. It's grief for the illusion itself. Not the person, not the years, the belief. The belief that enough love can save someone. The belief that understanding someone's wound makes you responsible for healing it. The belief that if you just stay long enough, try hard enough, sacrifice enough, transformation will come. The empath isn't just mourning a relationship or lost time. They're mourning an entire worldview, a cosmology of connection that organized their existence and gave their suffering meaning. If you've been sitting with any of this, feeling the weight of what it means to release something you organized your entire life around, there's a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings that might meet you exactly where you are right now. It's not about fixing yourself. It's about finding what's actually there once the grip opens. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. This third layer of grief is where the real death happens. Because when the empath releases the belief that their love can save people, they lose the narrative that made their suffering noble. Without that narrative, the suffering was just suffering. The sacrifice was just loss. The patience was just avoidance wearing a mask of virtue. And sitting with that, truly sitting with it, without rushing to replace one comforting belief with another, is the most painful thing an empath will ever do. Jung would have called this a confrontation with the shadow of the healer archetype. The empath's identity as healer, as the one who loves unconditionally, as the one who never gives up, that identity has a shadow. And the shadow is this: the compulsive healing was never entirely about the other person. It was about the empath's own terror of worthlessness. If I can heal you, I have value. If I can save you, I deserve to exist. If I can love you back to wholeness, then my own brokenness has purpose. This is not a comfortable realization. It's the kind of truth that makes people want to stop the process entirely and go back to the familiar pain of holding on. Because at least the old pain came with a story. At least the old pain said you were noble, selfless, deeply loving. This new awareness says something more complicated. It says your love was real, and it was also serving a function you didn't want to see. It says your compassion was genuine, and it was also a defense against facing your own emptiness. Both things are true, and holding both without collapsing into shame or denial is the work of genuine psychological maturity. Empaths who could move through all three layers of grief, mourning the loss, mourning the wasted years without getting trapped in self-punishment, and mourning the illusion without replacing it with a new one, entered a phase he described as the beginning of authentic selfhood. Not the self that was constructed around being needed, not the self that derived its identity from how much it could endure, but the self that exists independent of any other person's validation, need, or response. This is where the transformation begins to show itself, though it looks nothing like what spiritual teachings typically promise. The empath doesn't become radiant and blissful. They become quiet, present, strangely ordinary. The drama that characterized their emotional life begins to dissipate, not because they've suppressed it, but because the engine driving the drama has been dismantled. Without the grip, without the compulsive need to hold and heal and save, the empath's emotional landscape changes fundamentally. There's space now where the effort used to live, and that space feels foreign at first, almost wrong, like a house that's too quiet after years of chaos. Jung observed that empaths in this phase often described the experience using physical language. They'd say they felt lighter, like something had literally been removed from their body. They'd say their chest didn't feel tight anymore, that they could breathe fully for the first time in years. This wasn't metaphor. The grip had been held somatically, in clenched jaws, in tight shoulders, in shallow breathing, in a nervous system perpetually braced for the next crisis that required their intervention. When the grip released, the body released too, and the physical relief was so profound it sometimes triggered another wave of grief, because the empath realized how much pain they'd been carrying in their body without recognizing it as pain. But the most significant change Jung documented wasn't physical or emotional. It was perceptual. Once the empath stopped organizing their consciousness around holding on, they began to perceive reality with a clarity that had been impossible before. When you're gripping something with everything you have, your vision narrows. Your world shrinks to the size of the thing you're holding. You can't see the rest of the landscape because all your attention is consumed by maintaining the grip. Release the grip, and the field of vision expands dramatically. The empath starts seeing things they couldn't see before, not because the information wasn't there, but because they didn't have the bandwidth to process it while also sustaining the effort of holding on. They see relationship dynamics they'd been blind to. They recognize patterns in themselves that were invisible from inside the pattern. They perceive other people's motivations with accuracy that startles them, because their perception is no longer distorted by the desperate need for those people to be different than they are. Jung described this as the difference between projected perception and direct perception. When you're holding on to someone, you're not seeing them clearly. You're seeing your projection, the version of them that justifies your grip, the version that's going to change, the version that's better than their behavior suggests, the version that matches the story you need to be true. Remove the grip, remove the story, and suddenly you're seeing the actual person for the first time. This can be shocking. Empaths in this phase sometimes described feeling like they'd been living in a fog that they didn't know was a fog until it lifted. This expanded perception changes everything about how the empath relates to the world. They become more discerning, not because they've become cynical, but because they're finally seeing without the distortion of need. They can recognize who's safe and who isn't without the old pattern of overriding that recognition with hope. They can sense when someone is performing care versus genuinely offering it. They can tell the difference between someone who wants to connect and someone who wants to consume. And they trust these perceptions now, because the mechanism that used to override their knowing, the desperate grip on the belief that love conquers all, has been dismantled. This phase carried its own danger, because the empath who has just released a lifetime of holding on sometimes swings to the opposite extreme. They become isolated, guarded. They mistake detachment for health and numbness for peace. The grip was wrong, they conclude, so I'll never grip anything again. I'll never trust, never attach, never need anyone. This isn't integration. This is the shadow of the grip, the other side of the same wound. Jung was clear that the goal of letting go was never to stop caring. It was to stop carrying. There's a difference that changes everything when you understand it. Carrying means taking responsibility for another person's emotional reality, their healing, their growth, their happiness. It means subordinating your own existence to the project of managing theirs. Caring means seeing someone fully, feeling genuine compassion for their struggle, and choosing to engage from wholeness rather than from wound. You can care about someone deeply without carrying them. You can love without gripping. This distinction is where most empaths need the most support, because their nervous system doesn't yet know the difference. For their entire life, love and carrying were the same thing. Compassion and self-sacrifice were the same thing. Connection and loss of self were the same thing. Learning that these are actually separate experiences, that you can have one without the other, requires time, patience, and usually the support of people who've made the same journey. Jung noticed something else about empaths who had genuinely moved through the letting go. They developed a quality he associated with individuation, a kind of settled presence that didn't need external validation to sustain itself. They didn't need to be told they were good. They didn't need to be needed. They didn't need to rescue someone to feel worthy of existing. They had discovered something that the grip had been preventing them from finding all along. They were enough without the effort. Their value didn't depend on what they could endure or how much they could give. It existed independent of any performance of selflessness. This discovery is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. The empath doesn't become evangelical about boundaries or transformation. They don't lecture others about codependency or healing. They just begin to live differently. Their choices change. The relationships they tolerate change. The amount of dysfunction they're willing to absorb drops to near zero, not because they've become rigid, but because their body now knows what it feels like to be unburdened, and it refuses to pick the weight back up. People from the empath's old life often can't handle this version of them. The family that relied on the empath to absorb tension, to mediate conflict, to be the emotional shock absorber. They experience the empath's release as abandonment. The friend who counted on the empath's endless availability and unconditional support. They experience the empath's new discernment as rejection. The partner who was accustomed to being managed, understood, and forgiven regardless of behavior. They experience the empath's boundaries as coldness. Jung expected this. He understood that the empath's grip didn't exist in isolation. It existed within a system, and every person in that system had adapted to the empath's holding pattern. When the empath releases, the system destabilizes, and the system's first response is always to pressure the empath back into the old role. Through guilt, through accusations of selfishness, through sudden crises that require the empath's intervention, through performances of helplessness designed to reactivate the empath's rescue response. This is the real test. Not the letting go itself. The psyche handled that. The test is whether the empath can withstand the pressure to grip again, whether they can watch the system struggle without rushing in to stabilize it, whether they can tolerate being perceived as the villain in someone else's story when they know they're finally choosing their own life. Empaths who survived this phase, who held their open hands steady while everyone around them demanded they start gripping again, emerged with a psychological resilience that was almost unrecognizable compared to who they'd been before. Not hardened, resilient. There's a difference. Hardened means the pain has been walled off. Resilient means the pain has been integrated. The empath who has truly let go can still feel deeply, still love genuinely, still care about the suffering of others. But they can do all of this without losing themselves in it, without abandoning their own existence to manage someone else's. This is what Jung meant by wholeness. Not perfection, not invulnerability, not the absence of pain. Wholeness means every part of you is present and accounted for. The compassion and the boundaries, the softness and the steel, the ability to love and the willingness to leave. The empath who has let go hasn't lost their empathy. They've gained themselves. And a self that includes empathy without being consumed by it is the most powerful thing a formerly wounded empath can become. The critical moment of awakening isn't the fireworks. It isn't the revelation or the epiphany or the spiritual experience that rearranges everything in a single afternoon. The critical moment is the morning after the grip releases. The ordinary Tuesday when you realize your first thought wasn't about them. When you notice you're breathing without effort. When you look at your hands and they're open and it doesn't terrify you anymore. When the silence that replaced the chaos stops feeling like emptiness and starts feeling like room. Room to exist. Room to choose. Room to become whoever you are when you're not organized around the desperate project of saving someone else. Jung spent decades watching people arrive at this moment. Some reached it in their 20s, some in their 60s. Some never reached it at all, spending their entire lives gripping something that had stopped being alive long ago. The timing wasn't what mattered to him. What mattered was what happened to the people who got there. Because without exception, every empath who genuinely moved through the letting go described the same experience afterward. Not happiness exactly, not peace in the way it's usually marketed, something more fundamental than either. They described feeling real, for the first time, as if everything before the release had been a performance they didn't know they were giving, And now the stage lights were off, and the audience was gone, and they were standing in an empty theater discovering what their voice sounded like when it wasn't projecting for someone else's benefit. That realness is what the grip was preventing. Not because the grip was evil or the empath was broken, but because you can't be fully real while simultaneously contorting yourself to maintain a connection that requires your self-abandonment as the price of admission. The grip and authenticity cannot coexist. One of them has to go. And when the psyche finally forces the grip open, what floods in to fill the space isn't emptiness. It's the self that's been waiting, patiently, beneath all that effort, for the chance to breathe. And if you've been gripping, or if your hands have just recently opened and you're not sure what to do with the space, there's a guide called True Self-Discovery, with 24 reflection exercises built from Jung's work that was made for exactly this stretch of the road. It won't tell you who to become. It helps you find what's already there. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.